a day of remembrance.
No justice, no peace. Prosecute the police.
Today on Home, mourners gather to honor George Floyd, an unarmed black man killed by police. For days, thousands filled the streets calling for justice and widespread change. Finally, on Wednesday, the authorities responded. All 4 officers involved in Floyd's death now arrested and charged. But will they be punished? We'll look to history for the answer. And far beyond America's borders, inspired by protests here, the fight for racial equality brings crowds out onto the streets of Paris with demands of their own. A live report is just ahead. Plus, all of this is happening while the coronavirus continues to threaten our lives. We'll speak to a doctor in Ethiopia about outbreak projections and what this virus could do next. And of course, we'll answer your questions. That and so much more. Let's get started. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Home with Isha Sesay. The final tragic moments of George Floyd's death were captured in a heart-wrenching video that most people have seen by now. Those moments of him being trapped under the knee of Officer Derek Chauvin, gasping for air, crying out to his dead mother and pleading for his life. As we know now, he received no mercy, and George Floyd died there on a street in Minneapolis. Since that day, streets across the US have been filled with people protesting against his killing, people demanding change, people demanding justice. There has been so much anger, and there has also been overwhelming sadness that we have seen across the United States. But on this day, there is a chance for his family, his friends, and all those who stand with them to properly mourn and take in the full life of George Floyd, because this is the day of his memorial, which started a short time ago there in Minneapolis. That's where we find our own Taka Zen. She's also working with the Washington Post. She joins us from just outside of the location where this memorial is happening. Taka, good to see you. Can you tell us more about this memorial, which got underway just about an hour ago?
Hi, Aisha. I am outside of North Central University here, right here in Minneapolis. The memorial today will be eulogized by Al Sharpton here. You have a lot of different folks who come. I just saw Master P, a lot of different celebrities, but everyday people who heard about George Floyd are here. You have so many people who come from different cities just to be at the memorial of Floyd.
It is a time of so much sadness, people trying to reconcile how this could happen in their own city. You mentioned Al Sharpton there giving the eulogy. What is the sense of the mood there in Minneapolis on this day? Is there a sense of greater calm, or is there still that prevalent sense of anger at what happened to George Floyd?
You know, it's a mixture of all of the things. It's somber, but there's also that question in the back of everyone's head is Floyd going to get justice? I talked to one of the funeral directors earlier today, Tracy Wesley. He said he wants this to be a celebration of life, but he's been the funeral director for over 35 years, and he's incredibly angry and doesn't want to have to go through another celebration of life that resembles this. He wants to see young black men live full, joyful lives.
Yeah, no, and too many. There've been too many of these killings, and the cycle of protest and anger and promise of change that doesn't come. The 3 other police officers who were involved in the killing of George Floyd, we obviously have talked a great deal about Derek Chauvin. He was arrested and taken into custody some days ago, but it wasn't until yesterday, that the other 3 were charged and arrested. Talk to me about the feelings around those arrests. I understand that they're scheduled to appear in court on this day. Talk to me about what people are saying that now that these three have been taken into custody.
Yeah, well, some people are relieved. Some people are saying that they're happy that the other three have been taken into custody. Some people are saying it's about time. Some people are saying it shouldn't have taken that long in the first place. I went to a protest yesterday with Nikema Levy Armstrong, who's a civil rights activist here in the Twin Cities, and she spoke a little bit about that. Take a listen.
But why did it take all of this that we've been through, right? Protesting every single day for them to do what they should have done immediately after seeing that video and realizing it wasn't a medical incident. So while we celebrate that, we have to raise the question, what the hell took y'all so long? Seriously. We're not gonna just be out here doing no diddy for no crumbs. We're expecting justice for George. We're expecting justice for all victims of police violence. And we know that the way the system is set up, that these cops can still be tried by an all-white jury, who can still believe these fake narratives like the ones WCCO pushes out, and who can still decide to acquit those killer cops, even with video evidence that they're guilty. So that means we have to continue to be vigilant. We can't rest just because they finally did what they were supposed to have been done. We gotta keep marching, keep demonstrating, keep speaking the truth, keep protesting, keep shutting down until this whole damn system changes. Because the whole damn system is guilty as hell.
Yeah, so if you could hear her there, Armstrong was upset, rightfully, that it took as long as it did. She called out also yesterday media organizations who haven't been covering this with the full range, who pushed out the narrative that the police put out in the criminal report. She also asked for an independent prosecutor to oversee this case.
Yeah, I mean, given what she summed up there in her statements at that protest yesterday, is the expectation that people will remain on the streets, at least there in Minneapolis? What are you hearing about protests continuing in the days ahead, Taka?
Well, Minneapolis has been pretty calm. It's calmed down in comparison to a lot of the other cities. But I do see that there are some protests that are continuing to be scheduled just to keep that buzz in the ear that they want to see justice for Floyd. So I'll be continuing to cover those protests here in the Twin Cities as they come up.
Yeah, Taka Zane joining us there from outside the memorial service that is underway right now for George Floyd. A very somber day there in Minneapolis, and really it should be a summer day right around the country. Taka, thank you. Stay safe.
Thanks, Aisha.
So as you heard there, the memorial service for George Floyd is underway. Reverend Al Sharpton to give the eulogy, a number of well-known individuals there to stand with the family and his friends to remember the man affectionately known as Big Floyd. We'll continue to monitor the situation there in Minneapolis for you, but we want to broaden the lens and talk about the way these protests have expanded beyond the borders of the United States. We have seen thousands and thousands of people take the streets of France, the streets of Paris to be precise, as they have come out to show solidarity, not just with George Floyd, but to also shine a spotlight on injustices there in French society. And one man has been on the lips of many, Adama Traoré. He was a man who died in police custody some years ago, 2016 to be precise, and many questions remain unanswered. And to date, his family has not received the justice it deserves. Rukaya Diallo is a journalist there in Paris. She joins us now with more on all that is taking place in that country. Rukaya, welcome. Rukaya, are you on mute? It's the joys of this new technology.
Yeah, I forgot to unmute myself. Can you hear me now?
Welcome. I can hear you. Rukaya, just put into some kind of context these scenes we have seen across Paris in recent days. Thousands and thousands of people coming out, not just in solidarity with George Floyd, but to shine a spotlight on France's own systemic ills. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, so the main line of the protest in Paris on Tuesday was on the name of Adama Traoré. So you mentioned him. He died in 2016 in custody. He was just out in the street, and he had an ID check, and then he was arrested for no reason, and he died under the weight of three officers. So from that point, the family have been looking for answers and to get justice, and they didn't get any answer. So there have been the family has been very active in uniting people in the street, and I think that the tragic death of George Floyd was an opportunity for everyone to shed a light on what was going on in France. Because the thing is that the French media are very good when it comes to covering racial issues in the US, but when it's about France, they never mention even the topic of race. So there was a way for the organization that supports the Adama Traoré's family to say, well, it doesn't happen only in the US. We have our own issue, and we should really pay attention to it. So they decided to have that protest in the street, and it was a historic march. I think I have taken part to many marches against police brutality in Paris, and it was the first time that I saw so many people gathering in the streets of Paris for that reason. And what was interesting, it was that the fact that it went way further than the line of the usual activists. I saw many young people, for which it was their first march, their first protest, because there is a sense of something is going on and the issue is global.
And the media, you mentioned the media and how in the past the spotlight has been trained outwardly on the US and other places, but not on scrutinizing what is happening in France. What has been the conversation around reform, around change in the media? And the media aside, let me lay on top of that question, from French authorities, from the government, have we heard anything to recognize these scenes?
Not really. The government, the response from Christophe Castaner, who is the Minister of Interior, was really in support of the police forces, because after the protest, there have been some violence, some public goods have been destroyed, and the focus was on that. Even if it was at the end of the march, and it was mainly from just tiny groups of very young people, and so the conversation really shifted on those very marginal those events that happened in the end. And the Minister of Interior really said that he was in support of the police officers. And the focus of the media today is that some activists, some radical activists, are trying to import issues that are not ours, that are American. And the conversation is really going on that. So we're trying to say that it's something that is local, and that the march that took part on Tuesday was in fact part of a process of mobilization that really started before the death of George Floyd. But the main conversation is to try to say, we are France. We don't have such issues, and we don't need to frame in the French public landscape issues that are not ours. And it's very, very difficult to say that we have been facing racism, institutional racism, for a long time, and we need to have our own way of framing it.
And Ruqayyah, as you talk about this, I guess, and we're seeing it here in the United States, not everybody is embracing the reality or the truth of the systemic discrimination and violence that meets many Black people in their day-to-day existence here in this country. But let me ask you, though, for context. I mean, with George Floyd's death, I think one of the things that is so upsetting is that we have seen these violent deaths before. Of unarmed Black men and Black women we know of who have been killed. How commonplace is the killing, not necessarily the systemic racism and discrimination, but the actual killing of Black men and women at the hands of police? How commonplace is that in France?
I can say that it is as common as in the US. We have a very different history and a very different relationship to guns. The thing is that in France you cannot own a gun unless you're an officer or someone who has the right to bear a gun. So it's very difficult to have one. And most of the people who die in the hands of the police die through asphyxiation. So it's images that generally you don't see because it happens in police trucks or in police custody. So we don't really have images of that. And you have in 1 year you have 15 people who die in the hand of the police, but 19% of them are Black or Arabs, and most of them are men who live in like poor neighborhoods. So we know that there is an overwhelming number of people of color who die in the hand of the police, but it's not the same number as in the US. It's very different, but still we have a focus on them, and we have figures that say that if you are a young Black or Arab man, you are 20 times more likely to be checked by the police in the streets for no reason than anyone else. So that means that you have many risks to be exposed to police brutality, and we know that. And there have been some reports, and France, for example, have been sentenced several times by the European Courts of Human Rights for police brutality, and the government has made nothing to address the issue. And it's what's going on, because we have had many reports from the UN, from Amnesty International, from Human Rights Watch. Even the French Supreme Court sentenced the French state for police discrimination, for police check, and nothing was done after that, even if the court decisions were there.
And Rokhaya, just briefly, because I'm out of time with you, but I must get, just for context, in terms of prosecutions of officers involved in police brutality, what does the picture look like in France?
I can just pick the case of Adama Traoré. So it happened 4 years ago. None of the 3 officers have been prosecuted. So I just would like to remind you that Adama Traoré died under the weight of these 3 officers. So none of them have been prosecuted, and all of them have even been rewarded by the Minister of Interior for their career. So for now, there hasn't been any trial. Nothing has happened. And the reason why the family is protesting is because they demand justice, and they only would like to have at least a court case, which didn't happen.
Well, the problems are widespread and global. Yes. Rokhaya Diallo joining us from Paris. Rokhaya, we appreciate you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. Not even a court case in the situation of Adama Traoré. Raised fists, cries for justice, police crashing into protesters, tear gas filling the skies, a president calling for the military to come out into the streets to dominate and quell the scenes of dissension. I'm talking about America. This is America today. These are the scenes that have been playing out for the last several days. It is a far, far cry from Ronald Reagan's words of a shining city on a hill. That is not what we see here in America today. We see pain, we see injustice and frustration and a demand for change. And it has many people asking whether it is time to review the long-held notions about this country and its own self-declared superiority in the world. Take a listen to a conversation I had with a woman who feels very strongly on that front. Karen Attier, the Washington Post Global Opinions editor, joins us now from Dallas. Karen, welcome.
Hi, Isha. Thanks for having me.
It's so good to have you with us. So you wrote this phenomenal piece for your paper, How Western Media Would Cover Minneapolis If It Happened in Another Country. First, let me just start by asking you why you felt that this was the piece that needed to be written in this moment.
So this is the first time that I've written kind of this satirical take with this, sort of foreign correspondent conceit. I think the last time I did it was actually Charlottesville, so several years ago. So this isn't something that I do very often. It comes from a very, frankly, emotional place very often, when things seem so dark and so absurd. And usually after, frankly, violence, is when I'm just like, this is how we describe other countries all the time. And there are just times where it just feels like you could write a straight piece. You could write, denouncing, what's going on. And people have read that before. They've read that before. They read that before. We don't often read things that get the truth across in a different way. And I think like effective satire allows for really bitter, like nasty pills to go down with like a little bit of humor. And so for me, it was also just a catharsis, like for me to just express and imagine, in some ways, like imagine a different world, but then it's also to like expose, frankly, the arrogance and the American exceptionalism that we have, the Western exceptionalism, to frankly, kind of ride for those of us who are from the African continent, who are sick and tired of being looked upon as like being from poor and diseased places. I was just like, I'm just trying to flip the script like over and over and over again, as many times as I can, in 900 words.
And you did a great job with it. Let me read part of the piece, because I honestly think it's really, really smart and incisive writing. Let me quote from a part of it where you say, "Ethnic violence has plagued the country for generations, and decades ago it captured the attention of the world." You're talking about the US. "But recently the news coverage and concern are waning, as there seems to be no end in sight to the oppression. These are ancient, inexplicable hatreds fueling these ethnic conflicts and inequality," said Andrea Julik, a foreign correspondent whose only knowledge of American English consists of a semester course in college and the occasional session on the Duolingo app. I thought that was just so clever in the sense that you realize in that moment all these tropes that are applied to other places in the world, but let's focus on Africa. You hear these kind of these catchphrases that just pepper coverage of, the ethnic violence and oppression and the ethnic conflicts and inequality. Almost like we're locked in this cycle, which you flip the script on. And actually show are just as prevalent in this America that you write of.
Yes, America-stan is probably what I would call it if I had a name for it. I mean, I think a lot of it is in some ways it's not necessarily always super conscious in how I'm thinking about it, but in terms of ethnic minorities or majorities, we don't look at ourselves in the US that way. I mean, very often, people of color or Black people are other, and white people are the norm or the standard. They don't think of themselves as ethnic. We're the ethnic ones. Like, no, you are ethnic, right? And so I think that's part of it. And I think part of it is just, for myself and you as well. I mean, having reported from abroad, we operate under constraints. Obviously, we go into places where we don't always speak the language. To a certain extent, Andrea Julik, I'm not necessarily trying to knock her. It's just that acknowledging the limitations when we go into and we're asked to comment and report and carry an incredible amount of power, frankly, to report on what's happening abroad, that there are limitations. We don't sometimes speak the very language of the people that we're supposed to cover. It's interesting how that particular line got me a lot of criticism from.
Really?
That one, yes. They, particularly white male foreign correspondents felt like that was a cheap shot. And I'm like, are you kidding? Like, you and I know that you rely on fixers and translators all the time.
Totally. Well, Better yet, let me read this other piece, this other line from your piece, which again goes to again, just excuse me, just some of the attitudes and the way it's often framed. You say Britain usually takes an acute interest in the affairs of its former colony, but has also been affected by the novel coronavirus. We've seen some setbacks with the virus, but some Brits see the rising disease, staggering unemployment and violence in the States, and feel as if America was never ready to govern itself properly, that it would resort to tribal politics, said Andrew Darcy-Morthington, a London-based America expert. Two things in that, obviously, this again back to the sense of when you flip that and the way that script it has been used time and time again to talk about Africa, certainly a kind of inability to govern, a kind of we're lacking in the skills. But when you kind of transpose the conditions that they apply to Africa onto the US, again, you could make that very same argument, which rarely ever is made, about America and their ability to govern themselves well. And it's coming from a London-based America expert, which I love, because again, so often in the coverage of Africa, it is these people with some who have never even really spent a significant amount of time there, or who just read it in a book and yet feel they have the authority to define the continent.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's, I guess in this case, in terms of sourcing, when journalists are doing pieces on foreign affairs, I mean, very often they're calling up like the think tanker that's on the Rolodex that is sitting in Washington or New York. And because it's quick, to be honest. And that's who
lazy, but somehow accepted.
It's practice. It's common practice, and I think that this trope we hear all the time about Africa, that like, well, things were better actually under colonialism. We still hear that argument, or we still say, well, yeah, colonialism was bad, but at least they got schools, and at least they inherited indirect colonial rule, which has empowered a certain class, and they gained education, and it's just again, looking at how the state of affairs in America now, and again the mindset that I was in at 3 a.m. in the morning when we have this double whammy of the coronavirus and the George Floyd murder. And it just felt like we were in rock bottom, that we were in a failed state, that we can't even get healthcare workers, personal protective gear. We can't even get testing here. And so I think like that was my attempt to really just say, again, how common and lazy some of our practices are, but then also just some of these small ahistorical, cliched, arrogant narratives about us who are not white and who are not Western.
Let me read this final quote from the piece. You say, Africa could be an ideal asylum destination, as several African countries have managed to contain the coronavirus outbreak through aggressive early measures and innovations in testing kits. Senegal, a nation of 16 million, has only seen 41 deaths. Everyone predicted Africa would fall into chaos, Kango said. It is proof that being a black person in this world doesn't kill you, but being a black person in America clearly can. Do you think that this, I don't know if it's necessarily an unveiling, but certainly a kind of a brighter spotlight on the realities of living in America, do you think it will permanently alter the view of this country, certainly from abroad, if not necessarily internally?
It stands the chance of doing so. We've seen that in, again, I mean, I keep using Africa as a reference point. Obviously, it's from my experience, but you see, take my family's roots are in Ghana. Ghana has had its periods of unrest and a coup back in the 60s to the 80s. Things were not completely stable, and now democratically, at least, it is one of the most stable countries in Africa, in West Africa in particular. However, you still have the lingering effects, the lingering stereotyping of like, well, you know, is it safe there?
Mm-hmm.
Is it stable there? Are you, you know, does your family live in huts? Stuff like that. And so even though the situation has improved and moved on in the country, that strong impression of what the country was in the past, it's difficult to undo because partially because of reporting like this over and over and over and over. If you repeat something enough, it becomes true. We know that psychologically. So I guess, you know, I think obviously it's up to America in a lot of ways. If we want people to look at us differently, it means that change needs to happen. And it means that we need to, both in the sort of this kind of short or medium term crisis of coronavirus, it means we need to get together and do what is necessary to help prevent Americans from dying. And in terms of racism and police brutality, I mean, that is baked into the very DNA of this country. So I think that is a deeper, harder question to reverse. But at the very least, in reform, police reform, I mean, there are very tangible outcomes that we are looking at. But yeah, right now I'm getting calls from my friends around the world who are like, are you safe? Are you okay?
Isn't it a change? I mean, it's
right. I mean, the fact that like I had to tell somebody yesterday, like, oh, wait, what time is it? Am I under curfew yet? Is it curfew time here? In like the year of our Lord, 2020 in the United States of America.
totally.
Right? Yeah. And it's just, I think internally my mindset, like the conditions that we're under now have changed. We're sitting at home. We're afraid to go out because of a virus. We are, if you're Black, we've seen in the last few weeks that walking in Central Park, looking at birds, if you upset the wrong white woman, you could have the police called on you who could end your life. You could end up like George Floyd. And so I think it's even for myself and a lot of Black Americans, in a way, it's a hyper awareness of, frankly, the dangerous conditions we're living under right now. It's dangerous. Like it is. Things feel less safe. So I guess I wanted to convey that and, you know, imagine a world where we could find a place where we'd be safe. And I'm like, you know, Africa, you know, Okongo saying, hey, you could come here. We're handling the coronavirus better. We don't have white people with assault weapons and guns running around. Some of those nations actually have national healthcare systems like Ghana. It's not to say that, you know.
Yeah, and Rwanda and
right.
You know, has an efficient social safety net. And
right. Exactly. And so these are the things that don't get reported, which is why I felt it was very important to challenge that and to make people realize, again, as Mr. Okongo said, being Black is not an automatic death sentence in this world. There's an entire Black continent. There are Black people in other countries. But being here in America with its legacy of slavery and racism, and in the West, yeah, we're dying at higher rates because of the conditions we're living under here. So I wanted to make that juxtaposition.
Well, it's very, very clever writing, and again, once more reminds everyone of the power of satire and its ability to very softly, in some ways, guide you to flipping the script and seeing things differently. So we thank you for this writing. It's much needed at a moment like this, and I'm glad you did it. Karen Attiah with the Washington Post. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Isha.
It is very smart writing indeed. Someone actually just wrote in, I just want to share this with you. Nyasha Mutariti said, maybe I should relocate to Ghana or Rwanda. Hey, Nyasha, we're all wondering where we should be relocating to right now. You're not the only one. Thank you for all the comments coming through, many in that vein, and really looking at this moment and the US with a whole new view, a whole new set of eyes. Well, while our attention has been focused on the killing of George Floyd and the protests that have been happening up and down this country, you'd be forgiven for thinking that the coronavirus pandemic is over. Everybody's out, large crowds. not a whole number of masks in sight, or at least if they are, not necessarily on people's faces. So you would think that we had this thing beaten, but that's actually not the case. When you take a look at the situation globally right now, we have more than 6.5 million cases around the world, and more than 1.7 million of those are right here in the United States. So almost 2 million cases here in the United States. We want to take a closer look now at the situation with the pandemic and all this talk of a second wave. And I'm so pleased that we have a doctor joining us here from all the way from Ethiopia, and we haven't spoken to anyone in Ethiopia yet, so I'm super excited about this. Dr. Sion Frau joins us from Addis Ababa. She is a doctor of emergency medicine and assistant professor at Columbia University, and she's also special advisor to the Ministry of Health there in Ethiopia, and she joins us now from the capital. Sion, welcome.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
No, thank you. Thank you for making the time. You are there in Ethiopia. Let's start with the situation where you are. The WHO has expressed some concern about case numbers in Ethiopia. Give us some context on the situation and the response.
So in the past few days, the numbers which has been shared by the Ministry of Health has shown that the numbers has dramatically increased. In the past 1 week, there's been 300% increase in the number of cases. But surprisingly, the deaths actually have remained minimal. So far, I believe there's about 10 deaths, but the number of cases have increased. But just to kind of give you an overview, the first case was reported about March 14, I believe. And the first few weeks, before even the first case was reported, Ethiopia has taken drastic measures, such as closing down schools and also declaring a public health emergency, and also taking all the screening measures at the airport as far back as early February. So most of the cases that we had in the past few weeks are the ones that are alarming. But initially, before that, in the first few weeks, because of the strong measures that were taken, we were able to buy us some time. So so in the next few days, we'll see how this evolves. But again, it's full alarm at this point.
Okay. And with that being said, the key question to the heart of things is how much testing is being done?
Yeah, so, me as a person who's practiced in the US during the pandemic in New York, and also there's the question of how much test is always enough. So I think really the testing, it depends on availability, right? So initially it wasn't as available. In the past few weeks, the testing has tripled. Initially it was like around maybe in hundreds, now about 4,000 to 5,000 tests per day, a total of 120,000 tests so far. But at the same time, initially the other stringent measures that was taken by Ethiopia is quarantining every traveler that comes in a hotel, which where I am right now, even though I have recovered from the disease, they want to be extra vigilant and test me and at least quarantine me for a few days before. But everybody is for 14 days quarantine. So most of the cases for anybody that's traveling from outside to the airport and at the borders would get tested. So a lot of the positivity was from that, but now that we're seeing the community spread and doing a focused testing in most of the subsidies, and which is in the capital, and trying to spread the testing at the hospitals, and also making the testing criteria a bit more lenient.
Yeah, you just mentioned that you yourself contracted the virus. How sick did you get?
So thankfully, I also gave it to my husband, but so both of us were able to recover at home, which just required us to rest and sleep. Severe headaches, like headaches that I've never had before, and it was just exhaustion and fatigue and lack of appetite. So it wasn't anything scary. Me as an emergency doctor, I would know when to go to the hospital, so it did not require. But I would say, I was scared. I was scared for my life, because it was also about the same time when several colleagues around my age from other hospitals had died from COVID. So, and we've seen disproportionately how it kills people of color. So the anxiety was there. Walking to the bathroom from my bedroom, I would see my heart rate like go to 150, just a walk. So always my thought was like, is this the time when I'm going to drop dead, you know? But of course, I never showed that. So I would not make my husband or my family anxious, but the anxiety was there. And also in Ethiopia, the kids so far, the past few days, we saw a 29-year-old, a 30-year-old, and a 34-year-old die from the disease. So young ones are absolutely not covered, are not they're at risk too. So people should understand. Yeah.
To switch hats for a second, and we're so grateful that your husband, that you're doing fine, you're doing better now. So we're glad to hear that. Let me ask you to switch hats and shift your view to the US for a second. We've been talking about the crowds that have gathered to protest the killing of George Floyd and demand for justice. Huge numbers of people, every city in every state across this country has seen people gather. When you look at those crowds, knowing what you know about the transmission of this disease, I mean, what does it mean for this country in terms of the spread, in terms of a jump in numbers?
So for me, as a person of color, as a Black African woman and immigrant, I absolutely support the protest. And of course, as also a public health and a medical professional, I worry what might happen from this. I just actually tweeted this morning because a couple of people have been asking me, how come you support the protest as a medical professional? And we just learned today that George Floyd had survived COVID. He had COVID, but unfortunately he died from a police brutality due to racism. So, and I've said you have to fight those two epidemics, pandemics. We know that racism is not just a U.S. issue. I think it's worse in the U.S., just like as you were talking to your colleagues before me. But I think it's a global issue. It's a pandemic, and it's just been so phenomenal to see the whole world recognize and see the protests everywhere. So I think it's two important things that you have to fight and advocate. And I've been so amazed by how people are also been very careful with the protests, wearing masks, trying to practice some sort of social distancing. So the cases might spike, but I absolutely support the protest, and that's an important thing that we need to happen.
All right. So glad to get your perspective, and also just to get you sounding a voice of I guess calm, really, because I know many people are completely freaked out while at the same time supporting the protest. Excuse me, that we're going to see a massive spike in cases and more lockdowns in the near future. So it's good to get your perspective. Sia and Nusra, thank you. Please be safe, and we look forward to speaking to you again very soon.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you. All right, so that was important perspective to get on the situation with these crowds gathering in the US, and also the situation in Ethiopia, of course, where there is concern about the jump in cases, as you said, something like 300% increase. But we shall see what happens in the days ahead, and see whether they're able to contain the outbreak from spreading any further. All right, we want to move on now. We've talked about the health situation in Ethiopia, and of course how coronavirus and these protests could merge. Want to dig a little deeper into the issue of human rights here in the United States. People have filled the streets for weeks, as we've been saying, and the headlines, people have filled the streets in recent days, but for weeks the issue of race has been in the headlines here in the United States, as we've taken in the reality that Black and brown people are dying in disproportionate numbers to our white counterparts as a result of this coronavirus and the disease that causes COVID-19. You have coronavirus, you have the killing of George Floyd, you have this moment which has us looking at racism, discrimination, the entire system, and how it impacts Black people in the United States. And it's being scrutinized not just here in the US, but around the world, as you know. Let's talk more about it. Let's talk more about why the US has this difficult relationship with these issues and isn't making the progress as fast as we all would like. Joining me now is a man who's looked very closely at this. He's a human rights activist. He was also formerly the UN Special Rapporteur on assembly. I want to make sure I get it absolutely right, because it's actually quite an important title. He was a special rapporteur on assembly and right to gather and he joins me now from DC. Mina Kia joins me now. Welcome. Are you on mute? Everybody's on mute. Can you Mina, can you hear me? But can you, but we can't hear you. The joys of this technology. Okay, you log out and then come back in. We'll get you back in, and that's not a problem. And I'll get your title right this time, which is UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights to Freedom of Peaceful Assembly and of Association, his former UN title. It's a long one, Mina. So yes, we're going to talk to him about that. He was the former UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights to Freedom of Peaceful Assembly and of Association. He's going to join us to talk about what he saw in that capacity when he toured the United States in 2016. He's also going to talk to us as a human rights lawyer and just give us his perspective on where we go from here and how we bring about change. He's logging out, he's coming back in. This is the joy of the technology that we're all working with these days. Let me go to some of your comments. Mina, no, not yet. Don't worry, this happens a lot. It is part of the process. You're getting the baptism of fire right now. So while the team talks to him about that, I'm going to bring some questions to you. Kadi Mansaray, in response to this question of the protests and a possible spike in coronavirus, says, I'm worried that the crowds may spread the virus, but the protest is justified. I'm looking at these other comments. Albert Payano says that solution of relocation is thrown around a lot. Is it feasible? This is part of the conversation we were having around this moment in America. People now looking to see whether they should relocate anywhere else rather. And Albert says, is it feasible? I think that's an interesting response to that. Is it feasible? I mean, it's feasible if you want to make it happen. I mean, yeah, I don't know if that's the question. Is it feasible, or is it going to be as good as you think it will be? I think that's something slightly different. But if people want to relocate because they're tired of the system here in the United States, it's definitely feasible. Anybody could do that. Anyway, we're working to get Mina back and having some tech issues on that front. He's trying to get his audio right. So we want to move on and bring in our next guest and talk about the situation here in the United States, and we'll get Mina back in the mix on the backside. The killing of George Floyd it's dominating all our thoughts, understandably, and is prompting many important conversations. We've seen the people out in the streets. We've seen the calls for change. But the sad reality is it's not the first time that we've had to grapple with this issue of unarmed Black people being killed by police here in the United States. We have been here before. Sadly, it is not a rare occurrence. Let me give you some context now. According to the Washington Post, in 2019 alone, 1,028 people were killed by police in the United States. Now, half of those people were white. But here's the context that you need to bear in mind. Half of the people were white, but African Americans, Black people only make up about 13% of the US population. So we are being killed in disproportionate numbers, double the number of white people who are losing their lives at the hands of police officers. And the same goes for Hispanic Americans. There is something very wrong in the interactions between law enforcement and Black people here in the United States. In some parts of this country, being killed by police is a leading cause of death for Black men. We want to grapple with this, and we have the perfect person. Rashada Robinson is president of Color of Change, which is an online racial justice organization that's playing a critical role in catalyzing change in this much needed moment. And he joins us now from New York. Rashad, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's good to see you. It's
good to see you too. Listen, I know that the George Floyd Memorial is happening right now. Also know that those 3 police officers who were taken into custody and charged yesterday will be in court on this Thursday. Are you more hopeful today than you were yesterday about the situation?
I don't know if hopeful is the right word. I am, I think that it was important that we get to the point where these officers were arrested, but at the end of the day, we have a long way to go. We have watched officers get arrested before and go to trial and not actually suffer any consequences as a result. There's a couple of things that are at play, and I think hopefully people will recognize. One, police officers have a whole set of rules when they go into court on these cases that the rest of the public doesn't have. From sort of the very start of when someone is killed by a police officer and how information is shared and how they are able to deal with their police union, to all sorts of other immunity. The standard is very, very high for a police officer to face consequences, regardless of video, regardless of how much sort of we know. And time again, juries let police officers off because you simply need one person. You need reasonable doubt, which is not a standard that I'm going to push back on, but in a country that has deep levels of racial challenges, you set up a jury, you make the victim the enemy, you make the victim the problem, and then you get that one person to say, I don't know, maybe the police officer had a reason, and then the police officer gets off. And so I'm not hopeful. What I am hopeful about, which is not about the arrest, what I am hopeful about is what we're seeing out in this country right now in terms of people standing up and demanding something new, pushing for changes that are well beyond the type of things that people were willing to push for just weeks earlier, and recognizing all of the ways in which simple and short solutions will not get us to where we need to go as a country.
And so that being said, the difficulties in getting these officers prosecuted and getting them to pay penalties, what is your position on these protests continuing? I mean, where do you stand on that?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, people ask me about the protest, and I think the protests actually have to do with a lot of things, in my opinion, right? Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and then we had George Floyd, and all of those things happening so close to one another. But we also have a kind of a challenge that we've been dealing with as America's disinvestment, America's exploitation, attack on Black communities left us deeply exposed as the coronavirus rushed across the country and killing Black people at much higher rates, while we were also being tasked with overwhelmingly being essential workers in a lot of places. We were watching white men with guns show up to capitals, demanding people go back to work, actually in many ways demanding Black and brown people go back to work and facing no consequences whatsoever. And then you had these sort of killing after killing, and in each killing, watching folks on TV, watching folks in the larger public kind of explain away why there might have been a reason for it to happen, why that death was justified, that killing was justified. And so people had had enough. And so I think it's important for folks to know that you don't get to this level of uprising just on one incident alone. People are reacting to years, decades, hundreds of years, really, of oppression, and are recognizing that all of the ways, all the things we've been told about how to make change, you go to the polls, you elect an official, you get them to do things. Yes, vote. Yes, do those things, but people are recognizing all the ways in which that is just insufficient in and of itself, because folks have been voting, folks have been turning out, folks have been doing those things, and we recognize all the ways in which the system sort of aligns to prevent real progress.
And so clearly something has to be done differently is basically what we're saying. You can't keep having the same response to the problem. The protests are ongoing, but what else? What do you layer on top of that? President Obama spoke yesterday, and it was much needed. Many people talked about that. Your thoughts on what President Obama brought to this moment?
Yeah. So I thought it was important. First of all, I was really honored that President Obama asked me to be one of the 3 speakers after be on the panel. And so, that was an honor. And, the thing about President Obama, which I think is important to state, is that, look, I definitely met with the president a number of times on criminal justice during his administration, but me and my organization also stood outside the White House sometimes and brought petitions and challenged and made demands and sometimes really pushed in ways where we weren't always on the same page. And so, you know, the ways that democracy works is that elected officials and people in power have to be responsive to folks, regardless if you're sort of fully in favor with those in power. You know, the idea that on one hand you have a president of the United States turning hoses on peaceful protesters, and on the other hand you have President Obama willing to have folks that have been critical of him on various issues sit around the table and talk about issues. It's a completely different change in terms of how change happens. So just the sort of cultural dynamics of the day is important. I guess the other thing that I think was important was to sit and listen to someone that really knew what they were talking about. You know, that really had studied the issue, that sort of had a deep level of knowledge of the intricacies. I mean, I knew this when I went to the White House years ago after Philando Castile, Alton Sterling, and those Dallas police officers were killed, and he brought us sort of all to the you know, the White House and had us sitting around a table, and it was really incredible to watch the president sort of lead the whole meeting. You know, there was no staff sitting next to him. He was calling on people, pushing back on things, asking for numbers, and it was just such a command of information. And the thing about that meeting was that during that meeting, the head of the Fraternal Order of Police said something actually directly to me around, I was talking about racial profiling. And he said that all of this talk of racial profiling is new to him. All of the talk of racial profiling is new to him. And, you know, it's not that he was saying, I don't agree with your demands around ending racial profiling. He didn't say, I think you might be overstating racial profiling. He was basically saying it doesn't exist. He was gaslighting us. And so part of what I really appreciated from President Obama was that he did talk about sort of the barriers in our way of making progress. And as a person who held the highest position, the most powerful position in the land, he gave a lot of weight to the power of protest, the power of organizing, the power of everyday people pushing for change. Sometimes politicians will say, just vote. But President Obama also said, vote and show up and raise your voice. And I think that that's incredibly important because we need to hear that. Folks that maybe haven't yet joined us need to hear that from our leaders. Because they need to know that that change actually takes a lot more work than sometimes we're told.
Yeah. Rashad Robinson, it was so good to have you on the show. I hope you'll come back. We want to spend more time with you and really spotlight just the scale of the issue, the depth of the issue, the people who are working on this issue and have been working long before this moment. And we'd just like to share that with our viewers. So we thank you for today, and we thank you in advance when we bring you back.
Look forward to it. Talk to you soon.
Talk to you soon. Be safe. Take care. All right. We do have Maina back. He was joining us from DC. He's a human rights lawyer. Maina, can you hear me now?
Yes. Can you hear me?
I can. Yes.
Ah, hooray!
Hooray! You made it. God for phones. Man, it's not you. It's just this technology. It's very temperamental. So again, just to reiterate to everyone, you are a human rights lawyer. In the past, you held a position as a UN Special Rapporteur on the rights to freedom of peaceful assembly and of association. You made a visit to the United States in 2016, and amongst the things you said is that you call the country a nation of struggle and resilience. Talk to me about your sense of the country today as you look at the protests and all that has sparked this moment and people taking the streets.
Well, it seems to me that the U.S. has been caught up, and historically, with what people like to call the original sin, which was the sin of racism, the sin of slavery, the sin of segregation, and that struggle to fight that has continued and has been consistent since the 1700s. So it's gone on and on since the first African was brought to the U.S. 400 years ago. So it's that resilience that you see. And looking at the protests even now, and there's this wonderful clip that's been going around the internet where they show all the cities, a lot of the cities coming in. You see a lot of people, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people. That resilience, that anger, that determination to try and create change is what is the resilience in this country. But the contradictions within the US and what the US is about have been highlighted definitely by the coronavirus, and then by the killings of people of color, especially by the police. And again, it's not new. I mean, this was going on even in the Obama time. When I came here in 2016 on mission to the US, it was around that issue of corona, around killings of black people. The things happened in Ferguson, especially in Baltimore, and I went to all those cities. And it was that sense where the police were resisting the idea of black people coming together and fighting for change. And the fact that Black Lives Matter started during Obama's time is also quite instructive of the fact that despite the fact you had a black head of state, there was still a lot of structural and institutional racism that was affecting the lives of black people. So that struggle continues, and black people have historically been quite strong in this country and in fighting back, in resisting, in trying to organize and push back. And it's wonderful to see so many young people out there, who are going out and saying, we've got to have this change. We've got to stop this. It's been wonderful to see that.
And I wonder what you make of the fact that, despite the constitutionally given rights to assembly here or constitutionally protected right to assembly here in the United States, you've had the kinds of comments that have come out of the White House in recent days. I wonder what you make of that and what it says about the necessity of the right kind of leadership in a moment of crisis.
Isha, as an African, what I see here is very familiar. It's what we grew up with in Africa. Yes, we all know it. Absolutely. We have all got these stories about seeing. Yesterday, I went out near the White House to see what was going on, and you see this lines and lines of security. And my first thought was that, my goodness, but for the color of the security, this could be Uganda, this could be Kenya, this could be Ceylon, this could be Nigeria, for all we know. I mean, it is absolutely so it's very familiar for us. So, rights can be granted in constitutions, they can be written out in constitutions, but the implementation and the grabbing of them and exercising them is up to the people to do so. And of course, yes, leadership matters in the sense that if leadership is open to exercising of rights, if leadership is open to people coming out and standing up, then it will happen. I mean, look, it's still very much, any African will tell you today that what you see, even with the tear gas that was launched in DC and other places and rubber bullets and stuff, it still is a lot more safer to protest in the US than to protest in Uganda, for example, or protest in Kenya. I mean, it's as bad as it is a bit safer. It's not the same as protesting in Sweden, okay, or protesting in Norway or Finland. But it's still better than many countries that we have got. So it's we have to claim our rights. Our rights can be on paper. That doesn't mean anything. It's got to be us claiming them and exercising those rights. Otherwise, and this is a consistent struggle. When leaders are anti-people, when leaders are insecure, when leaders are dictatorial and they're not sure what they're doing, then brutality is their go-to option. And I think that's what you're seeing. So yes, indeed, leadership counts like crazy. It's very, very important. So,
I mean, how the protest is important, and as Rashad was just saying, the protests aren't just about George Floyd. There's been a lot that is, and you just said the original sin, 400 years and counting has brought us to this moment. How do you ensure that the protest continues to be meaningful, impactful, past this moment, and bring about change, and that the real work is done? Because we have seen the protests before, right? We are locked. It feels in some ways, the moment feels different, but we have at the same time seen the cycle before. How do we ensure that this has a different end game or a different result?
True. I think a number of things. One is continuous organization and mobilization of people. This is a moment right now. It may last another 2 weeks. It may last 1 month. It may last a day. We don't know. But it depends a lot on organizing, people organizing and keeping the groups together and ready and mobilized, ready to come out again. And then that's one thing. So keep that going and figure out a way in which you can sustain this protest, whether it's going to be occupies, where you sit down and you sit and wait for a week, and there's many examples across the world, from Ukraine, where people just took over a square and sat there for a month in the winter in Ukraine. I mean, look, Ukraine, Kiev winter is not like LA winter or Atlanta winter. Kiev winter is winter, it's minus, and people sat there for more than a month until they got the change they wanted. So you've got to be persistent, you've got to be resistant, but you've got to be organized, and you've got to be ready to keep that organization and those organizations across the country mobilized and ready. 1. 2, voting. People have to get out to vote in this country, and there's young people I'm seeing have to vote. They have to vote, and not just the presidency. This is the mayoral seats, it's the district attorneys, it's the state attorneys, it's at every single level, the council. Who are you electing? Police in this country are hired by the mayors. And so you've got to get a good mayor to hire good people, get a good police chief who can then get a process of change. When I was here in 2016, the city that I found was very much advanced at that time in terms of police, community policing, and relationship with the community was in Jackson, Mississippi.
Interesting.
And that was fantastic. I found that fascinating. It was the police chief then who was about to retire was a black man whose name escapes me now. It's I keep forgetting names these days, but he was a fantastic guy. But sitting there, I talked to elders in the churches, I talked to young people, to community groups, and they all said, look, we've got a good police force. They're helpful. They don't beat us. They don't do bad things to us. That was fascinating, in that sense that you can actually create that change. DC police, the Metropolitan Police in DC, had moved a long way from where it had been 5 years ago by the time I came in 2016. And again, that was part of that process of making the police much more part of the community. So it is important to do that. So those two things have to go. And even if, I'm telling this to as many Americans as I can find, even if there's political change of the presidency in November, please do not demobilize these organizations, these organized groups. They need to be intact. They need to come out. They need to light fires for the democratic people that are there, whether it's Biden, whoever else there. They've got to be organized. That if you don't do that, then politicians easily get into a cycle of comfort, and they start doing things as they've been doing, and it's buddy things, and they move on and they're happy. So you've got to keep that fire on the politicians right through, from at the local level right up to the presidency. Look, it's one of the things that I've loved about this time here is getting all the comments and seeing the anger even in Africa. The outrage in Africa, the amount of communication I get from my friends, from people who are all over, and it's people are angry in Africa.
Yes.
And a lot of this, a lot of this is on WhatsApp and on Twitter and stuff. And so it's people who are basically educated. So, but the challenge for me is keep saying, look, I like your anger. I like your anger about the US. Can you also have the same anger in your own country? Can you also face up to the brutalities happening around Corona in Kenya, in Uganda, in Nigeria? Yes, we've got it. And we can do it both. We can do both. We can, we Africans, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. We've done it before, and we can do it again. So we got to be able to channel our angers across the world, where people of color are affected, where people like us are affected, and that's the only way this world will become better. And I like this momentum. I like this solidarity existing, where Africans and the AU, the president of Ghana is commenting about the US. That's great. It shouldn't just be a one-way street. We can also comment on the US. It can't always be the reverse. The US is commenting on us. We have brains. We can say we have rights, and we can use them to say, this is not right, this is wrong. So I think that's been a great step to see that African leaders at some point are saying, we have the moral authority to say, you're not obeying your own laws, you're not obeying human rights standards and human rights law, and that this needs to change. That's great in that sense.
Okay, it's so great to have you on the show and to get your insights. I hope you'll come back again soon also to keep this conversation going, because in the next conversation, I do want to talk to you about the importance of coalition and allies and the role of white people in protest when we're fighting for Black rights. So I hope we can get you back soon to talk about.
I would love to be. I would like to do this. This is a privilege to be on the same show as Isha Sesay. This is for us Africans. This is it. You have reached. You have reached.
No, I hope there's more. Keep going up. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. All right.
Please take care. Thank you.
Bye now. Bye.
We that does it for us for today's show. I hope you enjoyed it. Some great conversations. You can go back and watch the show on Facebook. You can go back and watch the show on Twitter. It is there. We won't bring you a bright side today, not because we can't find one per se, but because there's a lot for us just to contend with in this moment. George Floyd's memorial is ongoing, and this is a moment for us to really reflect, not just on where America is, but as you heard Mina say, our own issues there on the continent as well. And so we want to end on that note and think it is a time for quiet reflection. But I want to thank you for being with us today, whether you're watching on Facebook, Twitter, or YouTube. Thank you. We'll be back with Home with Isha Sesay on Monday, same time, same place, a full show with great guests. Do join us Friday, where we will be on Instagram at 1 p.m. Pacific, and that will be a conversation around hope and healing. So join us there. That's our usual chop and chill spot, but it will be hope and healing, and we'll be talking about music that provides inspiration and hope and gives strength in this moment. And we know that from the continent, there are many songs from back in apartheid days and many songs that have been protest anthems. So we'll be talking about all of that tomorrow at 1 p.m. Pacific. Join us then. Otherwise, see you back here on Monday, same time, same place. Be safe, everyone. Thanks for watching.